Alright guys, we are back for section 6, and in this one we are talking about strain theories, which essentially argue that crime is due to frustration, usually economic frustration. So, here's our funny internet picture of the day. That is not how money laundering is supposed to work. Just saying. Alright, so, way back in the day, America, we had our revolution, 1776, kicked the British out. Soon after, France had a revolution too. And in the years following the French Revolution, this guy, Quetelet, I have no idea how to pronounce that, so I'm probably butchering it, but he was one of the first criminal justice or criminology people to really look at numbers and look at data. And so he gathered data about crime in France, and he found out that what we've kind of long suspected, the people who commit crime are generally young, they're generally males, they're generally poor, and they're generally uneducated, right? That's something that's kind of held true throughout most cultures in human history. But he also found this one other thing that affected crime, and that is relative deprivation, i.e., when poor people and rich people are near each other, that is where crime happens, right? So it's not necessarily poor, it's poor near rich, geographically. So if everybody in a certain area if they're all poor or if they're all rich, very little crime. But when relatively poor and relatively rich people are close to each other in both time and space, that causes crime. That relative change in economic condition is a driver of crime, not just being poor. And the more economic conditions change, the faster they change, whether it's up or down, the more crime happens. So if you want a low crime area, you want to find a place where everybody has essentially the same amount of wealth, and that's not changing very fast, right? That was kind of a revolutionary concept in criminology, to say, no, it's not necessarily the poor, it's people who are, it's poor people who are near rich people, and especially when those economic conditions are changing. A few years later comes this guy Durkheim, and Durkheim is maybe the biggest name in sociology. Sociology is a very similar discipline to criminal justice. In fact, criminal justice and criminology evolved out of sociology back in the early 20th century. Durkheim, huge famous sociologist, and he sat down and he wanted to describe kind of society and how societies worked. And so basically what he said is, the first societies were what he called mechanical societies, i.e. everybody does the same job or very similar jobs, right? Everybody looks like each other, everybody talks like each other, everybody has the same jobs, right? So, in early civilizations, everybody might be a farmer, or everybody might be a fisherman if you're living on an island somewhere, right? Or, but everybody has a very similar life in these mechanical societies. But as societies got bigger and technology got better and society changed, we turned into organic societies where we have a specialization of labor, especially, where now we have, not everybody's a farmer. We still have farmers, but then there are poets and artists, and then there's people who work for the government, and there's law enforcement, and there's all these different jobs that people can do, and that creates this organic society where people are all of a sudden different from each other. They see things from a different perspective, they have different life experiences, we get new religions, we get new customs, we get new, and as the more diverse we get in jobs and beliefs and customs and all these things, the more what Durkheim called the collective conscience goes down. It's essentially the social bonds, right? The ability to understand everybody around us. And that collective conscience going down means that social regulation of behavior becomes not as easy. It's not the only thing that can create changes in that social regulation. But it is definitely one thing. So the less social regulation we have, the more we have what Durkheim calls anomie, or normlessness, right? So when social regulations break down, this can be in times of economic change. This can be, if your government collapses, if your, I would argue that as I'm recording this is during the COVID-19 pandemic. I would argue that has brought down social regulation and is definitely causing a normlessness feeling among many of us in the world. And that anomie, that normlessness, is a driver of crime, according to Durkheim. And not just crime. He focused a lot on suicide. Suicides go up when there's times of this anomie, normlessness. Early 20th century, this guy Merton comes around. Merton was an American. He's one of the first Americans we've talked about in this class. But Merton, he looks at frustration as the cause of crime, and in particular, economic frustration. I mentioned at the beginning of this section that frustration and economic frustration is going to be one of the main theories of this, or main kind of focuses of this section. And Merton kind of looks at the American dream, right? We all, especially in the 20th century, but we all know kind of that American dream, right? You work hard, you get rich, you have that big giant house and a wife and 2.5 kids and a dog and a really, the latest automobile. And Merton kind of realized that that American dream is primarily economic, right? We want money so we can be rich to have all these things. And it's not really attainable for the vast majority of people, right? I mean, there are going to be a few people who get rich in this country. Bill Gates, perfect example, started from a middle-class family, ended up, for a long time, the richest man in the world. But for the vast majority of us, that's not going to happen. We are going to spend our entire lives in the exact same social class as our parents. That social mobility isn't nearly as common or as easy as kind of the media wants you to think it is. It is very, very difficult in the United States, especially in the 21st century, to gain in social class over the course of your life. So, Merton says, look, at some point in our usually late teens, early 20s, we figure out that we're not going to be rich. We're not going to be wildly successful. We're probably going to have the same type of living situation as our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did. And that's going to cause frustration. So how do we deal with that frustration? Well, according to Merton, there are 5 different ways to deal with that frustration, and it involves whether you continue to kind of believe in and accept the goals and the means of society, right? So when we say the goals of society, we mean money, we mean power, we mean, that brand new car. When we say the means, we mean, studying hard, going to college, getting a good job, working 9 to 5, wearing a suit, etc., right? So, if you deal with this status frustration, but you continue to accept the goals and the means, right? You still want to be rich, you still want the fancy car, and you still go to college and get a 9 to 5 and wear a suit and all those things. Merton would put you in this first category, which is conformists, right? People who conform. And this was written long before kind of the modern pejorative sense of the word conformist came about in the 80s. Not a lot of criminals there, right? Next group are those who reject the goals, right? They don't want that fancy car. They don't care about getting a bunch of money, bunch of power, blah, blah, blah. But they continue to accept the means, i.e. going to work every day. My grandfather was a good example of this, my mother's father. A Catholic guy. I don't think he really liked his wife by the time I came around. Didn't really, miserable kind of guy. Didn't like his life, but continued to go to work every day at this job, and he worked there for 40 some odd years before he died. So he was what Merton would call a ritualist. He really didn't care about advancing his economic position in life, but he continued to kind of go about doing the things that society told him he needed to do. He had his wife, he had 4 kids, he had, a house, but he never really wanted to advance beyond what he had, right? Those ritualists also, very little crime, okay? But now we get into the real criminal areas, right? So let's say we continue to accept the goals of society, i.e. I want the money and the power, but I'm rejecting the means to achieve those goals. I'm going to do something different, right? We call these the innovators. Now, Merton was quick to point out, these are not necessarily criminal. The aforementioned Bill Gates, absolutely an innovator. He completely revolutionized the world of computer software, right? He was an innovator in that sense, not necessarily criminal. But other innovators are criminal, right? So if you say, well, there's no good jobs around here, so I'm going to sell drugs. Or I'm going to start burglarizing houses, right? That's an innovator. You are accepting the goals. You want that money that it's going to bring you. You want the power. You want the fancy cars and the diamond rings and all those things. But you're not going through the institutionalized, accepted means of achieving them, i.e. getting a job, going to school. Then there are the people who reject the goals and means of society, i.e. I don't care about wealth, and I'm not gonna have a job. I'm not gonna do all the stuff that society tells me I should, because I don't want the things that society tells me to want. These are the retreatists, okay? And again, not necessarily criminal. There are lots of people out there who reject the goals and the means of society, who are perfectly law-abiding. But you also get retreatists like drug users, right? People who are just leave me alone, whatever, I don't care. So I'm going to escape into heroin. I'm going to escape into, meth, whatever. So retreatism has criminals, but they're not all criminals. And then the fifth group rejects kind of the entire basis of society, rejects the goals, rejects the means, says we want to set up a new system, right? And these are the rebels. These are the ones who want to change the world. And again, as I said before, not necessarily criminal. But there are a lot of criminal groups in here. The ones that spring to mind are people like religious terrorists, okay? But also groups like motorcycle gangs, right? They're definitely kind of rebels. We want a new means, new goals. We want our own different society separate from yours, right? So according to Merton, in sum, lack of social mobility causes frustration. When we realize we're probably going to have the same type of life our family does, we react to that frustration in one of those 5 ways. None of which is necessarily criminal, but some ways of coping with that frustration are more likely to be criminal, and different kinds of criminal, right? All right, so then we get Cohen. Cohen looked at gangs, okay, specifically gangs that form in and around the school years, right? So high schoolish kind of time frame in a kid's life. What makes people want to join a gang? And it's kind of similar to what Merton said, right? There's this frustration. There's this status frustration where look, I'm never going to be a good student. I don't care about school. If I did good in school, I'm probably not going to get a job in this horrible economy of, BFE town area place that I live. Like, what's the point of all this? I don't get it. It's stupid. So they get frustrated with that lack of ability, or perceived lack of ability to improve themselves, lack of ability to reach the standards that the school wants. Even if they did reach the standards that the school wants, they probably wouldn't get much out of that, right? So they get this frustration, and then they reject the authority of especially the school, but also parents and other authority figures, and start doing exactly the opposite of what they know that those authority figures want, right? And so it's not necessarily to get say money. They don't act out and do these deviant things for money or for material gain. They do it just because they're frustrated at their lack of ability to move forward with their lives, their lack of ability to reach whatever goals they might have. So they get this reaction formation where, oh, authority figures want me to do X, I'm going to do the exact opposite of X, right? They want me to go to school, I'm going to skip school. They want me to not smoke cigarettes, I'm going to smoke cigarettes. And they develop this defiance, right? Whatever authority is telling me to do, I'm going to do the opposite. And then they get peer respect for this. The other kids like them are like, oh wow, he's a cool kid, he did this crazy deviant thing. And so they continue with the defiance, not only for the the reasons previously mentioned, but also so they can get that peer respect. They want their peers to like them because that's the only real status they feel they can attain. They can't attain the status of, being rich. They can't attain the status of being successful. They can't attain the status of being smart in their own perception. So the only status they really have access to is that peer respect. They want the respect of the other kids around them who are feeling that same status frustration. And that's how kind of these gangs form, right? That's how we get into this situation where these students come together, they're doing this deviance to give each other respect, and they form these groups, and then they get more formal and they turn into gangs, right? Similarly, Cloward and Olin also looked at gangs. And it was they kind of say, yeah, it's kind of like that, what Cohen was saying, but there are different kinds of gangs, right? It's not just gangs don't all look alike. Not all gangs are created equal, so to speak, right? They wanted to talk about the differential opportunity of different areas, and depending on kind of the economic and authoritarian, I don't mean authoritarian, I mean the kinds of authority that are being defianced against, based on those opportunities in your specific area, you're going to have different kinds of gangs that form, right? So Cloward and Olin said there are essentially three different kinds of gangs. The first is the criminal gangs, where these are essentially looking for economic success, right? So these are the kind of gangs that are going to go out and have illegal kind of businesses, right? And this can be anything from loan sharking or prostitution rings or running numbers, that kind of thing, to burglary, drug sales, that kind of stuff, right? But they're essentially in it to get that status that they want. They're in it to get that money that they want. They're in it to get that power, but through illegal means with their gangs, in rejection of what authority figures kind of want them to do. Another kind of gang in different types of areas, different types of neighborhoods, different areas of the country, are conflict gangs, where their kind of entire purpose of having a gang isn't for money, although they'll still have some of those same money-making ventures, especially drug selling. But kind of the point of the gang is conflict, right? They're there to fight against other gangs. They might fight over drug selling territory, but the focus isn't necessarily on the drug selling. The focus is on the conflict. The drug selling territory is just kind of an excuse. But these conflict gangs, kind of the entire reason they're there is to fight against each other. These are also really common in places like prisons, where in the really bad prisons, there are conflict gangs almost always revolving around race. So there'll be the white gangs and the African American gangs and the Hispanic gangs and the Asian gangs. But their entire point is to kind of fight against each other and to protect each other from the other gangs, which is circular logic, but and finally there's the retreatist gangs, right? These are the guys kind of similar to what Merton was saying, where when people reject the goals and the means of society and just kind of they become these retreatists where they don't care anymore, they're not putting forth any real effort to accomplish much. So these gangs are usually like drug using gangs, and again, sometimes they'll sell drugs in order to make enough money that they can do drugs, or they'll commit burglary so they can afford the money to buy new drugs. But these retreatist gangs like their entire point is to kind of help each other while they're away from society, right? So there have been lots of movies about groups like this. I can't remember the name of that movie, but there was a famous movie from Scotland about heroin users that's kind of very similar to this, where it's a gang of people who all kind of hung out with each other and protected each other and all these things. But the point of the group was just to kind of be away from everybody, to just be alone, to do their drugs in peace, right? Anyway, that is the end of the first part of this section. See you in a few.